You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
You're listening to The Spirit Dimension with your host, Kerry Greenaway, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening and welcome to the Spirit Dimension. It's Sunday evening, and as always on a Sunday evening I bring you something a little bit different, and I bring you a whole realm of subjects to that we discuss in the studio. Now tonight, this is a subject that's interested me for quite a long time, and I brought my lovely friend Mr. Andy Mercer into the studio to help talk about this one. Good evening, Andy Mercer. How are you?
Hello. I'm not too bad at all. Not enjoying the snow we have here at the moment, but otherwise, yes, everything's fine. A bit of a blocked up nose at the moment as well, so I don't know what that's all about. I don't feel ill, just a bit nasally, so I do apologise if I sound a bit kind of bleh.
Well, it could just be the weather, because it is so cold at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it's horrible.
I got snowed on earlier. I wasn't impressed.
I had to pop out this afternoon as well, so it was unavoidable, the old family Christmas dinner, that kind of stuff, because I'm not around over Christmas, and so my brother lives quite a long way off, so we don't get together that often, so we had a bit of a Christmas get-together today, the family, and of course, woke up to all that snow. It was like, oh, great.
I know, I was like, a friend was saying, are you coming over late? And I was like, yeah, and then I looked at them and I was like, oh my God, it snowed! And she was like, yeah. And I was like, oh my God, where did that happen? It wasn't snowing at 4 o'clock this morning.
No, and as always, totally unprepared over here in Essex. There's no gritting or anything. There's just lots of snow everywhere.
It's more slush now, I feel.
Hopefully it'll disappear gradually, but we shall see. But other than that, yes, things aren't too bad, really. Been quite busy with work. Other projects are starting to come together, finally. I've been working on a few things, which I can talk about a bit later on. But, yeah, things aren't too bad at all.
That's very, very good. I'm glad to hear it. Now, tonight's topic, as I said earlier, is a subject that I find absolutely fascinating, mainly because of the time period it was in and the mindset of people regarding this particular subject back then. Now, the guy we're going to be talking about is a guy called John Dee, who was a philosopher. Well, there's so many things he did, isn't there, Andy? He covered so many different subjects: astrology, philosophy, occult. It's just a whole bag of things. And he was the chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth I.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's the chap.
Exactly. So how did that actually come about in the first place? Because particularly looking at how they were regarding, religion and witches and stuff like that, you would think there would be a very big intolerance towards what John Dee did. And yet he ends up being integral part of Queen Elizabeth I's decision-making.
Well, in a sense, it does kind of highlight a bit of hypocrisy in those days. First of all, you do have Elizabeth, who was a Protestant, Church of England, so a bit more liberal, a bit more open than you might have from a Catholic. Obviously, her sister, who would have been Queen, was Catholic and managed to make sure she didn't get the throne, so that kept things a little bit more open. But if you were in a high society, if you were moving in royal circles, or you were quite wealthy or well-to-do, then you could look at magic and witchcraft, etc., and be relatively safe. But if you were sort of poor and living in a village somewhere and people didn't like you and you were into witchcraft of any kind, shape or form, that was it, you were in big trouble. So it was that kind of division between the haves and the have-nots. Now, Dee himself was a very intelligent man. He was, as you said, a mathematician, he was a scientist, astronomer and astrologer, which in those days were more or less the same thing. And he was very much a knowledgeable man. He was part of the court circuit, if you like, the people who were close to the crown. So he was an educator of the Queen. He did actually teach her in her younger days as well. So they were already familiar to each other before she became Queen. So there was always a connection there, which he kind of just built upon, which was rather sensibly. You sort of keep in good stead with the monarchy at the time, just to keep yourself safe. So that's really how it sort of kind of came about. He was just known to be a very knowledgeable and intelligent man, had a huge collection of books, and his own collection was the basis of the British Library later on. He was the guy who coined the term the British Empire, the idea of us sort of conquering other nations and growing our territory, if you like. So, yeah, it was a pretty impressive chap, to say the least.
He certainly was. So do you think because he was quite integral in her younger years, in that time of uncertainty for her own future, that's where that trust got built with John?
Very much so, yes. Yes, it was a confidant. He was never, as far as we know, never fully sort of employed by the Queen or anything like that. He was very much around, if you like. He was just sort of there in court and was giving advice. And often if she was out riding in the local area of Mortlake, which is in South London now, but was countryside then, a village, she would often stop at his house for a private conversation sometimes. We don't know what they really talked about on occasions there, and there was a little concern sometimes that she was too familiar with this man who had a reputation from quite early on of having an interest in magic of different forms. So there was a little bit of concern in those earlier days, but once she's on the throne and Queen, there's nothing they could do to stop it, basically. She could do what she liked in those days. So that's really kind of how it developed. So he wasn't actually employed by her or anything like that in an official position that we know of for definite. I mean, there are certain rumours about him being involved in spying and espionage a little bit later on, which I'm sure we can get on to a bit later. Yeah. But that was not 100% definitely confirmed. It's been strongly rumoured and stories about it, but it's still not totally confirmed, if even that's the case. So.
Okay. So was he completely removed from court, or was he actually involved with other members of the court at this time? Do you know?
Well, he was just generally there, one of the sort of people who was around. And when we say in court, I mean, he literally was on like a list of people that was okay, as kind of way you could put it. He'd be able to sort of travel up to. They weren't in Buckingham Palace. I can't remember where they were. The Queen's residence in London was at the time. At one point, it was Somerset House, and then there was a very large house on the Thames, which no longer exists, unfortunately. It was actually burnt down. No longer there, not in the Great Fosse as before then. So I'm not quite sure exactly where, but basically when she was in court, if you like, when she was home, when the old flag was up high up the mast, which is a sign that the Queen's in residence, then he could, occasionally would be there, literally in court.
But he wasn't really sort of like a main part of like the political field.
Well, kind of yes and no. I mean, it's very different, obviously, to our times now. The Queen had various advisors that she would turn to for matters. It was much more of a kind of a direct rule in those days. There was Parliament, etc., but it wasn't the power that he is now, obviously. It was still very much the Queen was the head of everything, head of government, head of state. And she had various advisors. As I say, he was one of those advisors, not necessarily at the top of the list, as it were, but he was one of those that was close by. And excuse me, because of his interest in magic, sometimes people were a little suspicious of him and not too sure what to make of him. But he was always a presence, if you like, in court, certainly.
Okay. It has been suggested. Oh, I can hear myself.
Oh dear.
It has been suggested that Queen Elizabeth made certain decisions regarding the ruling of the country and decisions she made regarding things like the Armada and stuff like that, that she followed John Dee's advice on timings in regard to astrology.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Probably the most important one was that he gave her the date for coronation.
Yeah.
She wanted a particular date that would be auspicious, that would mean she'd have a long reign, and she had a very long reign. So, yeah, I mean, that was one of his little triumphs, if you like, choosing the right day for the coronation, and it seemed to be successful.
Okay, so how does he do that? In with the technology that he had back in those days? I mean, we know that he worked with divination tools. We know that he worked with occult kind of magic. We know that he did he conversed quite often with angels, didn't he? Didn't he make the Enochian language?
We'll get on to that definitely in a little while.
Oh, yeah. He did that. So how did he, in regards to astrology and looking at the stars, how back in the day, how did they do that with just a very basic telescope?
You answered your own question.
How did they do that?
They knew of 7 planets for definite, and their charts were based on those known 7 planets, their movements and movements of the sun and the moon to cast a horoscope. Not a million miles from how you do one today. It's still the practice hasn't changed that much. We've added a couple of planets into it, but the general practice of drawing them up themselves is pretty much the same. One slight difference you would have had in Dee's time would be the claim, and he was indeed charged with the idea that not just drawing up the astrological chart, that by drawing it you'd have influence on the person you were drawing it for. So if you were to draw up the chart, say for example a rich noble person, that you might actually affect their life by simply drawing up their chart, which kind of sounds a bit odd to us, but this was one of the thinkings that he was accused of on one occasion. I remember rightly, he was actually accused of deliberately drawing up a chart in order to have influence over that person, and I think it might have been I can't remember who it was. It was somebody very high up anyway, early on in his time when he was younger.
Okay. We have had a question saying, did other high-ranking official nobles at the time seek John Dee's advice, or was it predominantly the Queen?
Yes, there were others, certainly. He had lots of people who'd come and go. One thing about Dee that was helpful is that he kept copious diaries and notes of communications. He had like a court diary of what he was doing with sort of royalty. He'd have a personal diary about day-to-day comings and goings, and of course he had his magical diaries, of which there was at least usually 2 on the go at any one time. So they do show that he was consulted by various people throughout sort of the years of his life on various matters, often to do with sort of future predictions like astrology, etc. But yeah, just generally because he was very knowledgeable. He's one of those people that you just don't get these days. Most of us, if you are sort of successful, usually in one particular field, you become a professor of physics or, astrophysics or whatever. Back in those, people were genuinely interested in anything and everything. So you wouldn't be an expert in just one thing, you'd be an expert in many things. So, and he was, he knew a lot about a lot of things, basically. So often people would come to him for advice. And, back in those days, there was no real clear division between science and magic. They were pretty much seen as very similar, almost the same thing. So often people would come for advice to see if you could perhaps consult with the stars in astrology or consult with crystal balls, etc. That kind of thing is very much part of Dee's day-to-day life.
Okay, so let's have a look at because where did this learning come from? Because where did John Dee first start in his early life? Was he born noble himself, or was he a poor person?
We don't know a vast amount, to be perfectly honest with you. When he was younger, he was probably sort of middle-ranking kind of ordinary family, not wealthy, not poor. So there's not an awful lot we know. One of the things you tend to have a problem with is these people kind of emerge almost from nowhere. I mean, there are things that have been written about he may have been of Welsh descent, and his father was perhaps a courtier. I mean, I'm reading it from Facebook, I have to from offline here. But, he basically, there was not a vast that we can know about him from his early days. It was more just sort of piecing bits and pieces together. But no, he wasn't particularly a wealthy person or particularly a poor person. He was educated. His father, as I say, earned enough to put him through some kind of education, which was helpful. In fact, he was at school not far from here, over in Chelmsford. But, he kind of, a lot of these people do almost emerge almost from nowhere. They kind of just move in the right circles, get to meet the right people, get the right connections going, and then you become better known.
I see. A little bit like Cromwell was in the Henry days.
In a sense, yeah. You don't necessarily have to come from great wealth to be successful. If you sort of get to know the right people or in the right place at the right time, you catch the eye of nobility or royalty, then your fortunes can be set for quite fair, provided the person whose eye you catch remains in power. Then you're often doing quite well for yourself. Obviously, if the person whose eye you caught then falls out of favour, then you often fall out of favour with them. So it's often things to be careful of. So
yeah. So although we don't know an awful lot about his early life, one thing's for clear: he had incredible intelligence and able to retain information, and was learned in lots of different fields, not just one particular field. And actually was actually quite accurate because of certain things he foretold, whatever.
Foretold, yeah.
Yeah. So he is incredibly skilled in what he does.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about those first incidences from where his reputation starts?
Well, again, not a hell of a lot, because it's not an awful lot was recorded. As I mentioned before, his interest in maths and science and magic kind of linked together. There is one story I do remember having read previously about Dee, was when he was actually at school. They were performing a play, and he was able to create the illusion of someone flying just by sort of ropes and pulleys. But people, being people in those days, thought that somehow there was kind of witchcraft and magic involved. It was just simple trickery. It was an illusion. But he was accused then of witchcraft. And so this was quite early on in his life. So he obviously had an interest or connection with magic from a fairly early age onwards, even if it was being mistaken for magic, when in actual fact it was just sleight of hand magic, if you like. But certainly the interest was there from fairly early on. I mean, a lot of universities of the day would have had, obviously, libraries, and had sort of old manuscripts of magic, so he may well have read a few and come across some. But also, he was innovative in himself, coming up with his own ideas of what he could do and what he could be achieved. So,
well, that is the other thing with him. He seems to have been able to evolve into his own form of occultism, didn't he?
Well, it was just a shared interest. It's important to remember that we're not talking about clearly defined topics here. They're all kind of an amalgam of different kind of areas of interest that weren't necessarily seen as strictly divided as we'd see them now. You know, astronomy and astrology were seen as more or less the same thing, whereas today astronomer is very different from astrologer. But in those days, they were seen as kind of the same thing. The difference between sort of magic and science, again, the division wasn't very obvious or very clear. We're talking about a period of time, the 1500s, were pre-Renaissance, before that kind of division, the Enlightenment period, where these things start to become more divided as topics. That comes another 100 years after Dee's life. So in his time, it was much more kind of a mixture of all sorts of things all together. There was no definite. This is why I've bunged up noses now. I mean, no definite. Between these topics, they were sort of amalgamated almost together as a man of knowledge, a man of learning, and would learn whatever you could learn.
And
I mean, that's really how it comes about.
Yeah, and he had an extensive library, didn't he? He was forever collecting books and holding on to books, and they were always books regarding this whole range of topics that, to the majority of people back in the day, would have been far beyond their ability.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the average Joe public couldn't read anyway. In those days, very few people could read, and reading English is one thing, but being able to read Latin was a very different thing entirely, which, of course, Dee could read as well. So he had the ability and the skills to learn more. I mean, most sort of important documents would have, in those days, written in Latin rather than in English or a European language. Latin was kind of like English is now as the international language. Latin was the language of learning in those days, and it would be something that you would learn your native language and Latin wherever you were from. So you could kind of converse with people, not necessarily talk Latin, but you could read it. You know, documents were written in Latin, so people from different parts of the world, parts of Europe, which was the world really in those days, could actually read those documents as well. So once you have that knowledge of that particular language, and you can acquire documents from across Europe and be able to read, at least have an idea of what they're talking about, which is what Dee was fascinated by particularly. And was collecting all sorts of manuscripts and all sorts of topics, including the occult.
This would have cost him money.
Mm-hmm.
So where did his money come from?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but that's a good question. I don't entirely know, to be perfectly honest with you, because I say we only of Dee's life itself, we have only really Dee's own records, you know, his own diaries that he kept. He does crop up occasionally, obviously in court circles, etc. But you know, his actual source of income, I don't entirely know. I mean, he was teaching, so I can only assume he taught privately and was teaching and was being paid for that teaching. As I say, I do know he didn't receive any financial aid in terms of money from the Queen. I think later on in life, he was given the job of the rector of Manchester College, and was then paid for that post. But the Queen didn't pay him herself, but he was given that post and would earn money from that. So, as far as I'm aware, there may have been just an accumulation of some wealth from his parents. As I say, his father became quite successful later on. So I can only assume it was coming from there, really. But as I say, it's difficult because we don't have lots of detailed records or lots of people talking about Dee. They only really have, in the main, as I say, Dee's own diaries to give us a real idea of his day-to-day life.
Okay, so Dee's diaries.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that start? Does that start right from the beginning, or does that start from a particular point in time?
Now, which particular ones are you referring to? Remember, you used to keep at least 4 going at any one time.
So. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
I can't even keep one going, let alone 4.
Well, that was it in those days. There wasn't what else to do. There was no TV to watch or a radio to listen to. There was none of this business. So it was like, what do you do? Sit at home at night reading books or writing, because there was not much else to do with your life. Basically, he kept a diary of his own personal life. He kept a diary of his court activities, and he kept diaries to do with general kind of astrology, astronomy, etc., science, and also diaries to do with his own direct workings with magic, with what became later known as angelic magic or Enochian magic. But that's a bit further down the line. I mean, I think it's probably worth getting into the whole reason why he was getting interested in magic more and more in the first place, because that's obviously where the story really starts, as they say.
Well, that's true.
With Dee, it was very much wanted to increase his understanding of the world, his understanding of knowledge. As I say, he was versed in most big topics, if you like, science and maths and geography, astrology, astronomy, science, philosophy. He was knowledgeable in all those areas, but wanted to know more about how the world worked, how it operated, how it existed, what was the way in which the world was operating. And for someone of Dee's time, the 1500s, when we're talking about 500 years ago now, you're really talking about you have to find out from the source. And for him and many like him, the source was God. Therefore, if you want to know more about how the world is really working, you ask a guy who supposedly built it, i.e. God. And that was really the idea, was to be able to communicate with angels and God himself, or itself, or herself, whichever you prefer. So that's really how he began to work more directly with what we now call scrying, which is the gazing into the crystal ball. And as I think we've talked about previously, the actual term scrying does specifically refer to crystal ball. It's been used as a term for all sorts of other ways of looking at things now, but scrying originally was just with a crystal ball or crystal sphere. So that's really how it all begins with Dee, was to try to find out what's going on, how the world works, speak to the architect, if you like, the designer and the builder of reality, and perhaps he will give you some more insights as to how it all works. So that's how it first began. The real question of what he was trying to achieve was to communicate with whatever was out there.
So was that a post-D? Was that a concept, the scrying, that was used pre-D, or was that something he evolved for himself?
Well, scrying's been around since the Egyptian times. The idea of looking into a body of something, like often water, was a common way of working. It goes back to the Egyptian times. There's always been that method of communication. But the archetypal image you have of the gypsy Rosalie with the big earrings looking into a crystal ball at the psychic fair, that comes from Dee's time. That's really, he was one who would use that specific notion of how to achieve it. And again, not incredibly sure where the first ball or sphere he used came from, but there is actually a story in the Dee's diaries of one particular occasion when they were scrying early on, trying to get this communication going, which I'll talk a bit more in a minute, of one crystal ball literally appearing out of nowhere. Literally appearing in the room as a bright light, which suddenly dulled down to about the size of a golf ball, probably a little bit larger, of which was smoky quartz, just literally appearing out of the blue, about egg-sized, egg-shaped, and that seemed to be given to him directly by some angelic force. So that became the main way of working. One of the common mistakes that's made, if you ever visit John Dee's materials which are available to viewing in the British Museum, they're actually on display, you'll see a large black obsidian mirror which has been labelled as John Dee's. That was never John Dee's. There's no record at any point anywhere in Dee's diaries of using an obsidian mirror. It most likely was used by a chap whose name has escaped me, who had the case made and was working with the angelic magic, as I've always preferred to call it, about 150 years later. And it's been added into the collection, where it's like a major feature of the collection. It's quite large, about the size of a dinner plate, but it was never John Dee's. He never used an obsidian mirror. It is a way of working, and it can be quite an effective way of working with the obsidian mirror rather than the crystal ball, because they tend to be quite small and hard to see into. So people tend to use the obsidian mirror, but it wasn't Dee's. He never used one of those.
No, I've seen, this is one of the very first times we spoke properly, wasn't it? I'd been to the British Museum and I'd seen this smoky quartz ball, sphere, sorry. And I was like, it's so small. I was expecting a large sphere, not a tiny. It's tiny.
Yeah, it's pretty small.
But that was allegedly given to him. I need to have words with angels. I need some things given to me. A smoky quartz ball, please. That'd be great.
That's what appeared. I mean, as far as we know, he used several different ones throughout his sort of time, if you like, working with the Enochian system as it became known, or angelic magic as I prefer. But yeah, one of them, I'm pretty sure that is the same one that said at the British Museum, appeared out of the blue or out of the bright white light.
Wow, that's manifestation abilities. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
So, oh my goodness, it's such a huge topic. His work in regards to this. Where did it... So that's why he started, was basically trying to connect with the architect to find out why. To learn and find out reasons why. How did that then evolve? Did he find out the reasons he wanted to find out, or the purpose behind life?
Well, it's debatable, certainly, but I'll tell you the story about how it all really started to kick off, if you like. Yeah. We think he probably did advertise locally or sort of in the press, as it were, or just by word of mouth, looking for someone who could scry for him. Now, he'd attempted himself to say this was the common way of communicating with these forces, was to look into a crystal ball. He'd tried it himself and got absolutely nowhere. He couldn't see a damn thing. So he decided to try and employ the services of a scryer, who'd be a person who'd sit and gaze into the crystal ball or the sphere or whatever to see what they could see and report back to D what they were seeing. The first person he tried was a chap by the name of Barnabas Sewell, who saw a few bits and bobs and nothing too spectacular and wasn't really getting very far. So the word was kind of out there that he was looking for somebody, and someone calling himself Edward Talbot quite literally just turned up on his door one day and said, I can do that for you if you like. Now, the first early scrying sessions again produced a few bits and pieces, some imagery and some insight into angelic forces and beings. And in fact, they managed to assemble what's become known as the Heptarchia system of the seven planetary system of magic, which is an early version of D magic, if you like. It's not Enochian in the sense of the stuff that comes later on. It's an entirely simple single separate system of magic, and Dee was pretty impressed by this. By this point, Edward Talbot, as he called himself at the time, was producing quite a lot of material which Dee was writing down, and he seemed to produce a fairly simple but quite coherent system of magic, so called the Heptarchic system, the seven planetary system. For some reasons it's not entirely clear, suddenly he starts being called Edward Kelly in the diaries. Now, one of the speculations is that Kelly was actually, his real name, was using the name Talbot because he'd been either charged with coin forging or clipping, as it's called, where back in those days a coin was actually made of gold or silver to denote its value. So it's quite literally, it was worth its weight in whatever material it was made from, gold or silver. And what people would do was clip tiny amounts off the edge of a coin and just obviously gather it up. And in time, eventually, you'd have a sum of money in terms of tiny bits of gold, which you could then melt down and form into blocks or lumps. That was called clipping. It was a fairly common crime because it was often hard to spot. You're talking about tiny little bits shaved off the edge of a coin. If it's something like gold, which is quite soft, bits will rub off naturally anyway. But if you get caught doing that, it was quite a serious crime. What they do is actually clip your ears. So you're clipping the coin, you get your ears clipped, top of your ear gets cut off. And the illustrations that we have of Kelly always show him wearing a hat or long hair. So we don't know. Maybe his ears really were clipped and that's why he went under an assumed name. Again, there are rumours that he had criminal links in the past. But yet, by the same token, he appeared to have a genuine gift, as others had reported working with Kelly and said there had been some success with him. So that's how it really began, and they started almost daily communications quite quickly, beginning to build up the system of magic. Now, I'll be honest with you, my knowledge of Dee is based primarily around the actual magic, the angelic magic, rather than Dee's life. It's not something I knew a vast amount because, and quite frankly, it doesn't really matter that much to me for my interest is the system of magic. But I do know that they began to experiment and word got out of what kind of things they were working on and talking about. And he was actually invited over to Europe, and mainly Europe at that time was very much interested in alchemy. One of the big things in that time was the old idea of alchemy, of literally turning lead into gold, which, if you could actually do that, would be spectacular. And on the surface, it looks like, why couldn't you? Lead's this dull, soft, grey metal that feels exactly the same as gold in terms of its structure, its feeling, its weight. It feels the same. You've just got to change its colour effectively. Now, of course, they didn't understand atomic structure like we do today, and we know it's pretty much impossible. But for them, because it looks so similar to gold, why couldn't you turn it into gold, turn this base metal into valuable metal? So there was a real big thing, was alchemy, was trying to create gold from lead. And unfortunately, Kelly made the mistake of once claiming he'd done it. And of course, if you've done it once, why can't you do it again? So he was got a chance to travel into Europe. This is Kelly, with Dee, and on the idea that they were going to be able to create real gold from lead, and then obviously make people lots of money from doing that. But of course, it was impossible. So they tend to kind of move around quite a lot, from different sort of courts to another court, until they got to Prague and the Czech Republic, as it is now, the Czech Kingdom of those days, where they were able to actually set up a laboratory, because the king at the time, whose name has escaped me, I must admit, was very much asking all the alchemists around the world to come to him and to work their art in various areas of magic, all in his kingdom, because he was very much interested in it. So that's kind of where they moved on. That was the day-to-day kind of movement around, and often the angels were predicted they should go to this place, and that these people would be helpful to them or wouldn't be helpful. And that was the kind of thing. Also, they wanted to see if the angels could predict the future and give them useful information that they could actually disseminate out, and kind of didn't really. It was quite hit and miss as to what they were able to actually achieve. It's the Holy Roman Empire, I do apologize, it came to eventually, that they moved into the Holy Roman Empire was most of Central Europe at this particular point in time, so that was all within the same kingdom.
So really, basically, they're using other people's money to forward their own experimentation. So they're using other things.
They were given the opportunity to make some money from what they were doing. Yes, I mean, it wasn't. Again, remember, these people weren't deliberately trying to con anybody. As far as he was concerned, these things were entirely possible. Good old Kelly might have been a bit of a confidence trickster at some point in his career, but they generally believed that they could do the things they were claiming they could do, because at that point, their knowledge of science was such that they wouldn't necessarily have realised they couldn't do things like make gold out of lead. And I mean, there are people even today who claim that is possible, which is a bit strange, because chemistry tells you that's not possible at all. They're quite different metal. They have some similar properties. They're not. You can't just by sort of sleight of hand and heating it up and adding extra bits and pieces create a different metal from it.
Well, it would have been done and well used, I feel, if it had been achieved at any point, then or since. Now, how did that?
If it's done once, everyone will be doing it.
Yeah, and the monetary system would be completely debased, and we would have found something completely different. So, how did that then evolve into the angelic realm and the Enochian side of things?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because it gradually evolves over a period of time. They were introduced to various little entities or spirits or angels, whatever term you prefer, that would communicate to Kelly through the crystal ball, then to Dee, who would write down what was being said. It got to the point that there was a little angel called Medimi who'd often turn up and would introduce other angelic forces to them. The initial ones were the classic sort of Raphael, Michael, etc., the names you'd recognise that they would know, of course, as well. But they were also instructed to create this thing called the Sigil DMF, which is a very complex symbol of 7 sides, and it's got all sorts of letters and numbers and characters, as to say, written into it. It's very complex. They were designed to construct it, told to make it out of beeswax, to be 9 inches across, the single disc, and then to make 4 small ones that were 3 inches across, 4 inches rather, which would go under the legs of a table they were told to make. The table had a very specific design carved onto it, which they were instructed to create. All these things were designed to be created so they could communicate with the main angelic forces. And the version of the sigil or DMF that they initially were told to use was found in another book of magic, which is a simpler version, but they were then told to draw this more complex version. Now, that original 9-inch disc is still visible and available to be seen in the British Museum. They've actually got the actual thing there that Dee had made, or made himself even. So they were given instructions to construct this very specific, very particular form of, I suppose ritual tables, for the better to put it, the kind of environment, if you like, for conducting magical experiments, as they were described. And they were early on given the language of the angels, which was an entirely new language, although there are some vague elements and hints towards ancient sort of Middle Eastern languages. There's some similarity in terms of the letter shapes that suggest it might not have been completely unknown previously. Versions of it may have been knocking around. But this version that it was given was brand new, and what the way it worked was that Dee was given the description of the characters by Kelly, who would write them down as he described them. Well, Kelly would draw them as he was seeing them in the crystal ball, and the very first versions you can actually find in Dee's diaries are quite rough, and then they were given slightly later on a much clearer version of the characters of the Enochian language, and that was the first kind of new thing that was completely new that came through that, as well as the sigil DNF itself was an advanced version of one that existed previously, but the language appeared to be quite a new thing. And from that, it gets even more interesting because they were then being told how to communicate with other angelic forces. Now, the interesting thing was, and this is the fascinating thing for me and other interested in John Dee and Enochian, is that they have a very complicated, detailed system of communication with these angelic Enochian forces, but there is no diary records or entries anywhere of Dee actually communicating with these forces. Only a description of how to do it. No notes or records of him ever actually doing it, which is a little strange. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But it suggests something's missing, something's been lost, which is really unfortunate because, as I said before, Dee tend to keep diaries on different topics. So he may well have had a diary that recorded the Enochian sessions, and then another diary that recorded the actual communications they had with these forces. That's the weird thing. We're given descriptions of how to communicate with these forces. We're given names of some of these forces, but we have no record of them actually communicating with them. So that was what makes it really quite fascinating, that although there was this detailed explanation of how to do it, but no evidence of them ever actually doing it. And it starts to get stranger still because he is, by this point, actually asking the angels for advice about what to do next. Now, the problem is, of course, all communications coming via Kelly. So Kelly could easily be saying what he wanted to happen for them to do, and it wasn't the angels saying it. We've got no way of knowing it, of course. So how much may be Kelly's own interpretation, in quotation marks, and how much is actually being said by the angelic forces, we don't know. But some of the things that they are producing, there's no way that Kelly could have made up. Now, this is where it gets a bit more, even more complicated, if you like. Incidentally, let me explain one thing quickly. The term Enochian, where that comes from. One of the things that Dee was interested in was the Book of Enoch. Now, this is a biblical text which is mentioned of, but during Dee's time, there was no actual example of it. The book of Enoch was missing. Enoch himself is quite a fascinating character. If you know anything about the Bible, he appears to have not died, but basically been taken to heaven alive or ascended into space alive. And he describes seeing a very strange visions of otherworldliness that's supposed to be in the book of Enoch. Now, since Dee's time, there are actually no less than 3 versions of the book of Enoch have been discovered. There's a Slavonic, there's Ethiopian, and there's another one whose name escapes you right now. But they turned up sometime after Dee, but Dee was quite a believer that these books existed, so in that sense he was correct. They did exist. But what happens at one point, and this is probably the most fascinating part at all for me, is that they are given instructions of a magic book that they can have dictated to them. It's called the Liber Lagoeth. Now, Dee thought it may well be the lost book of Enoch, but what it actually became is very, very strange. They were given instructions to create grids of characters of 48 by 48 across, and 48 of them, and one of 96 characters by 48, so one much bigger grid. They were told how to draw these up, and they were told which character went in each one of the boxes individually. Then they were told the grid references for something, for letters for them to write down. And what they were given was the instructions for how to create what are called the Enochian calls, the angelic calls, except they're dictated to them backwards, one letter at a time. So they had to be written down backwards, one letter at a time. And as they wrote them down, it became clear they were actual proper sentences. They were actual proper words. It wasn't some kind of random jumble of letters or characters. It was actual words they were given, and it was like, it's almost apocalyptic poetry, if you like, of describing how you can connect and communicate with these angelic forces if you say the words correctly. That was all done over 40 days. Now, bear in mind, as I say, it was just the two of them working with Kelly seeing what he was seeing and writing down what Kelly was seeing. In the space of those 40 days, they had to create the Liber Legoath book, which I say is these grids, and it's thousands of characters, as you can imagine. It's 49 by 49 across, 49 of them, and then this 196 one, much bigger. They put that together within 40 days, which is pretty amazing, really.
So many questions.
Yes, that's why I stopped.
So, okay, let's look at the communication table, because that fascinates me, because that links into so many different concepts that we could bring forward now. Has that ever been recreated that we know of since John Dee's day?
Oh, the whole kit and caboodle, the whole thing put together many, many times. I've seen examples of myself.
And has it been successful?
Oh, yes.
Oh, it has?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know people have actually. I mean, I must admit, I've done some of it. I've constructed parts of it. I haven't gone the whole hog, but exactly as it's supposed to appear. But I know people who have done. I've seen photographs of it with setups that mirror exactly what Dee was supposed to build, and did build clearly. He was obviously using the system, so they certainly exist.
Right. Okay. And it has been successful, you said.
That I know of, absolutely, where people have been able to communicate with these angelic forces. There was a guy whose name escapes me at the moment who was basically publishing his own material, which was additional communications. Now, again, of course, you could say, well, maybe he's just making it up, but he was adamant that these are direct communications that were coming from them. Now, again, what it gives you is the instructions of how to use the Book of Enoch, the Liber Legoath, of how to use that to communicate with these angelic forces, which myself and many other people have made use of and had incredible results with. Now, when I say incredible, what I mean is you get visions, you get images in your mind that are very strong, very clear. And what's fascinating was, and what I found was, this is back in pre-internet days, when I read other people's experiences of working with the cause, seeing what would happen with them, they were seeing very similar, if not identical things. And that was really quite amazing.
Okay, so looking at it from a psychological point of view, we've got John Dee, who's obviously very logical, he's very intelligent, he's very learned, he's actually quite set in science, the science side of things. Even the subjects that weren't considered scientific end up being scientific in this day and age. So that's where his mindset is. And then he links in with this Edward Kelly, who hasn't got such a good reputation, who's been known as a little bit of a con artist. Do you think that this wasn't just another form of con?
Well, if it had been lots of random rubbish and lots of stories of this to do and that to do, etc., then maybe, may well be. But as I say, the thing that really hits it home is the Enochian cause themselves. You just couldn't... Even two people deliberately contriving to construct something over that period of time, it would have been hard work. Now, there's no doubt about it. Dee was an honest guy. He wouldn't have been interested or been involved in out and out con because he just would not be in his nature. That's just not the way he works. He got nothing to gain from doing that. So, as I say, there's a very good chance that you could trust him if you were a bit dubious about Kelly. Now, Kelly again had some education clearly, but he wasn't a great man of intelligence. So he couldn't have constructed that system himself and fooled Dee because it was just too big. There's just too much to it. I've shown the language itself, because as I say, there is a whole language and it's got its own syntax and structure different to English. I showed it to him when I was at university. I showed it to my lecturer in philosophy of language. I didn't tell him a lot about it. I said, what do you think of this? And I showed him the material and explained what it was about, how it was a separate language that looked a little bit like something from the Middle East. And he agreed, yeah. And I said to him, I told him a story where it really came from, and he was like, in words to effect, if you're pulling my leg. He didn't say that exactly, but into the language you might have used there. He was like, no, this is made up. You're making up. That's nonsense. This is a proper language. It's not just what you call a cipher or I forget the name of the term, where you substitute one letter for another, which is what you get ciphers basically are. I said, no, this has got its own structure. It's not English. This is a different language. And I told him the story behind it. He was like, no, I don't believe you. I do not believe that. So, I think he did some research himself afterwards and thought, that's amazing.
That's interesting.
But, yeah,
because
so say...
the other thing with that, the other side of that is if that's how they got it, they were told to make these grids with all these letters and that's how they got it. How the hell did they understand that themselves? Because it's not English or Latin or a language they would have known. How did they then understand what was said in that communication?
It is explained to them what letter means what character means what. Some characters combine up to create, like you have TH is one letter, for example. Some letters of our language that didn't exist, they don't have. So they have substitution letters, like there's, if I remember right, there was no V, there's a U instead, and that kind of thing was going on, or there was a V rather than a U. So you have substitution of some letters for others, but when you make the words together, they are different. They're not English. They are sentence structuring slightly different. I mean, I can actually read some of this stuff to you if you want.
Yeah.
I came across them directly. Now, as I say, they were given some instructions, and there is some debate about exactly how you pronounce Enochian, so I'm not going to bother trying, because for one reason, it's been said more than one occasion that if you just start reading Enochian aloud, without any preparation or work, you actually are causing an effect. Now, whether you want to believe that or not is a different matter, but I think for the safety of radio, probably better if I don't read the Enochian, but I can read the English to you quite easily.
Okay, we'll go with the English.
They're given one character at a time, backwards, from the last letter forwards, as you like. It's only when you rearrange it back the other way around, you can then see it was a word. Because basically, for example, the last word of the first call is highest, okay? So they will be given the reference of grid 11, line 15, character 10 is a T. Write the T down. Grid 12, line 35, fifth letter across is an S. So you have TS. Grid 40, line 25, character 11 is an E. You write E down. Okay, so you see how it's working now.
Yeah,
so you've got T, and then you get another 5 letters, and you think the next letter given would be the H, then a G, then an I, then an H. Highest.
Why was it given backwards?
Because of the power of Enochian. They didn't want you to say it, because it's so powerful that even just by reading it off at random, you can actually start invocation effect. That was the reason they were told to write it that way around.
Ah, I see. Oh, my goodness. Wow. Are these texts readily available in this day and age for people to get hold of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now I'm worrying that there's loads of people reading Enochian texts out and causing all kinds of, like, angelic beings to come down, and they're all getting a little bit sick to death of it.
That could be happening. That's what might happen to you. Yes, the answer to your question is they are readily available now. Now, again, there's a bit of a story behind that, which I'll quickly tell you about, because obviously we're going to run out of time at this rate. It's nearly 10 to already.
I know.
John D. and Kelly worked for a number of years together. They produced a lot of diary material. I mean, what I've just described was the key. That was the core material. The Enochian calls and how you use those to scry the Enochian worlds, if you like, and you're travelling off, because you have those series of keys, and then there's a last one which is called the Key of the Aetheas or Aetheas. Now there's 30 of those, and these are basically realms that you can travel to. You actually can actually travel to these places, and that's the idea. And that's the thing I was talking about, the imagery and the visions that you have when you work this out. When I tell you, it is bloody powerful. You know, there's no two ways about it. You're not making it up. You're really experiencing. The closest I can describe it to is if anyone's ever experienced regression hypnosis, where you're actually going back in time to an earlier part of your own life. I don't mean past life stuff. I mean genuinely remembering something you've experienced years ago. When you were hypnotized, you will see it and experience it much more real than you do when you sit remembering something. It's a bit like a dream. You know, when you're in your dream feels very real. And these places felt very real as well when you actually explore them. Dee himself had no intentional plans to have this material published. It was his own work for his own benefit and interest, really, primarily. But what happened is that when Dee travelled around Europe the second time later in his life, his home was raided and broken into. A lot of his material was stolen, and some of it passed on to other people's hands when he died. And cut a long story short, they were acquired by a chap called Merrick Casaubon in the 1600s, mid-1600s. He acquired these later diaries. Now, I'll explain what happens here because it's quite interesting. The diaries have got split up. The earlier ones were stored or thought to have been lost in a large chest that belonged to John Dee. The other diaries passed to Mercer Casaubon, the later material, which includes some of the stuff we just talked about, how the cores are constructed. They were passed on to Casaubon, and Casaubon published them in 1659 under the title of The True and Faithful Relation of What Passed for Many Years Between Dr. John Dee and Some Spirits. Now, Casaubon was trying to show that Dee was basically a fantasist and he was a fool who was taken in by charlatan Kelly. So he published them to try and discredit Dee. It was trying to make him look a fool, which is a bit of a shame, really, but he kind of succeeded, basically, because John Dee's name was almost expunged from history for a long time. It's only relatively recently they've been able to recognise actually he was a very important figure and should have really been mentioned. If you do any kind of biographies or films or anything about Elizabeth I, you have to mention Dee. You can't leave him out. Yeah, a lot of the old films, if you see films about Elizabeth I, Dee doesn't appear at all. Yeah, he was an important person. It's only really the recent ones, like the ones with Kate Blanchett, who played Elizabeth. There was two films. The second one, Dee appears in that. It plays quite a prominent part in some of the scenes because he was an important figure. But he was ridiculed and made thought of a fool because of Mercer Casaubon. Now, Casaubon published the diaries, I say, in 1659, but unfortunately they are not very easy to read. They are full of all sorts of errors of spelling and mistakes, because Casaubon wasn't that bothered, really. He didn't want to be that accurate. He just wanted to sort of make this stuff look, well, make money out of it, basically, because it was obviously people were buying the book. And it was only available from a doorway at St Paul's Cathedral, which sounds a bit strange, I know, but there are lots of little publishers used to be based around St Paul's Cathedral, and you could buy books from one of the doorways where he used to sell that, or people selling it for him. For many years, that was the only known example of Dee's work. It was this poorly put together diary, a printing of the diary, which I say is full of errors and spelling mistakes and inaccuracies, and that kind of sort of was available but was never reprinted. It just kind of disappeared, if you like. It was almost forgotten about for many, many years. A little bit later on, coming to 1660s, with the Great Fire of London, a chest that had passed from Dee, so his own family, if you like, it had been bought at auction and was owned by somebody whose house was in danger of being burnt down during the Fire of London. And the owner of the house rescued this large trunk that he owned. And when they removed it, and this trunk, I'm shortening the story a little bit, but basically they moved the trunk and there was a rattling sound coming from inside. And lo and behold, they opened up and found some papers. Now, unfortunately, they had no idea what they were and didn't think they were any real use or value. And one of the housemaids, now it's not quite clear exactly what was happening because it mentions this word pies or pies. Now, she was either using the pages she found to wrap food pies in for to preserve them, or was being used for pyres, i.e. used as lighter, so fuel for fires, to burn them. So effectively they were being destroyed, they were being either burnt or used to wrap in food. And it's these diaries, the early material and other material. And I've often speculated that what was lost, we know a certain amount was lost before someone realised, actually, this looks like something quite interesting, that what she was probably using, I think, was Dee's records of him using the Enochian system. Because I said earlier on, there was no record of ever actually using the system. And I reckon, and other people have said the same, that's what was destroyed by her, was the actual diaries he was actually written about his own experiments using the system, using the communications, the realms he was seeing, his experience he was having using the chords. Fortunately, someone did recognise this looked like something quite interesting and took it to a guy called Elias Ashmole, who is the best known for the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. He was also very interested in magic and the occult and supernatural, and he was fascinated by these, and actually he bought them or exchanged them from a book for the person who brought them to him, and he had those the earlier records. So they existed, and he actually used the system himself. There's actually record of Elias Ashmole's own experiments with Enochian, and they're in the Ashmolean Museum, and I've got copies of those, which you can now get online. That kind of disappears into the mists of time until you get into the late 1800s, and a group called the Golden Dawn, Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn, who were a group of Freemasons interested in magic and the occult, who formed a magical society, basically, the Golden Dawn. Now, the Golden Dawn is the precursor to the modern occult world, the New Age, all that kind of stuff, all comes from the Golden Dawn. If it hadn't been for those guys, you wouldn't have all the other stuff. People like Gerald Gardner involved in the Golden Dawn, although some Wiccans deny that, but he definitely was. So his ideas, he takes from the Golden Dawn. There are other groups. So the Golden Dawn is incredibly important, and they rediscover the Enochian system. Unfortunately, they decided to alter the system to fit their own preconceived notions of magic. They were very much Hermetic and based on Greek and Hebrew mythology. So they made a lot of changes to the system and produced their own version of Enochian, which is quite different to the original ideas, but they believed that the system wasn't workable on its own and had to have additional material added to it. So then you fast forward the time again, a bit further into the modern time. These diaries have always been available, or always have been held, by the British Museum. And they've always been there, or the British Library, I should say, sorry. Someone in the 1990s, getting a long story, decided to actually pay quite a few pounds to actually be able to get copies of the microfiches and put them online. So for few years, you've been able to view Dee's original, actual handwritten diaries of the Enochian stuff and all his other stuff is actually available online to read. And that's where I first found it back in the 1990s and became absolutely fascinated. Well, I knew about it from the Gold Mine Ninja and the Golden Dawn. I was also interested to know about the original course system, which is why I first became interested, because I actually saw them online and thought, wow, this is amazing. This is the actual handwritten Dee's own material of his experimentation, and I found it absolutely fascinating. It's since been republished a number of times. The original Merrick Hasselborn book was republished for the first time in the 1980s, and I've got the first reproduction of it, which is an exact facsimile of the original book Merrick Hasselborn had published, so I'm quite pleased with that. I know somebody's got the real original, and he paid like £9,000 for it, and yeah, exactly, I have seen it.
I think 30 quid is expensive for a book, let alone £1,000.
This cost me £300. My reproduction cost £300, but it's an exact facsimile reproduction of the book, the cover and everything. It's also been reproduced by an amazing chap called Dr. Stephen Skinner, who's actually recast it properly into the Merrick Hasselborn book, I should say, back into the same format, but in modern English, modern typeset, making it easy to read. And he's corrected many of the mistakes in Hasselborn's own version of it. And most recently, the Magical Diaries, the entire collection of everything that both Hasselborn printed and the early stuff that was rescued from the fire have been put together in one massive, or actually two massive volume set, which again, it's following the format of the diaries, but written in proper modern font, so it's easy to read and correcting all the mistakes in the earlier material. That recently, literally came out a few months ago. And it's called, I'll read it for you.
I love it, he's got this book.
Of course, Complete Magical System of Dr. John Dee.
Wow.
Complete Magical Record. John Dee, 2-volume monstrous set sitting on my shelves over there now. So that brings us right up to date.
It does. Now, what worries me about this is if the Enochian language and all the workings that John Dee did back in the day are that incredibly powerful and it is that readily accessible out there for people to play with, I will use that term, without using the proper protections and stuff that you should have in place. Because there's a lot of people that would jump straight to that connection.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredibly dangerous.
It is and isn't in some ways, because you can follow the system through exactly and not in what you're doing. Then you will learn how to do it by following through the system. If you think, right, I'll never go at this, or you've got to do it properly. If you don't do it properly, it won't work. Basically what it comes down to. If you don't follow the steps correctly, it's not going to work for you. Simple as that. But if you don't know the system, want to do it properly, you'll learn the system by trying to do it properly. It's a complex system. You do need many of those elements I was talking about. You don't necessarily have to have the full table setup, etc., but you have to have an understanding or an idea of what you're doing. So by trying to use it, you will learn how to use it, if you like. If you just sit there reading those chords aloud, the chances are nothing's going to happen, because you haven't got the correct elements in place to work it properly. It can do. Things can happen. I know people who've experienced with it and rather wish they hadn't. But again, you could say it's psychological. If someone's telling you it's going to have X, Y, Z effect, and you think, oh, it's having that effect, then okay, maybe it is, because you believe it's going to. But by the same token, what struck me when I worked with the chords of the Aetherius to sort of travel to the realms, if you like, was what I was seeing seemed quite unique to me until I started reading other people's experiences. I thought, actually, there's similarities here. Not identical by any stretch, but certainly sufficient level of similarity to think, hey, there's more than just my imagination going on. There's something else that's at work here. Now, you can do an entire other show about exactly how that works or why it works or where this stuff comes from. There's a bit of a debate in the moment in the sort of occult world of what they call the psychological versus the spiritual model. Now, I try not to be in either particular camp, because some will say it's all just in your imagination, in your head. Others will say, oh no, you really are communicating with supernatural beings from other realities. And I think it's somewhere between the two. I think this stuff does exist independently of us, but its existence is not dependent upon us, but we play a part in that communication. It comes from deep within the collective unconscious. These are like archetypal type consciousnesses you're connecting with at the deepest level. Now, it's a bit outside of what Carl Jung would have agreed with, although again he had a strong interest in spirituality anyway. But I think there is that. They're not independently existent without us, but they're not dependent upon us. It's the middle zone I often talk about, which I've done previously, about where this stuff's coming from. It's not just in your head, because your head is far bigger than you realise. It's not just your own personal consciousness. There's that idea of that collective unconscious, the transpersonal consciousness that I think is a reality that exists, and these things exist within that, sort of the deeper levels. But, you know, it's one of those things you say, the Enochian entities, they're not angels, they're not demons, they don't conform to either pattern, if you like. It's a debate I've had before. You know, we talk about demons as you talk about them today in modern times. We are based on a very much a medieval concept of demons. Before that, they didn't have a distinct, you know, if they were good or bad. They were one or the other. You know, they weren't. They could do good things, they could do bad things. Depends on how you were towards them. You know, if you're rude and nasty, they're going to bash you around the head. You know? But if you're supplicating and friendly and hopeful for help, then they're liable to help. So they're not strictly divided. And there's no doubt about the Enochian entities are the same. They're not good, they're not evil. They kind of depends on how you approach them, if you like, as to what kind of response you're going to get out of them.
Well, my goodness me, what a show is all I can say. We can continue if you'd like to, or we can continue this on another show.
Well, the only thing I really want to obviously get in is that I have a book I wrote myself on my own personal experience.
Go for it.
Working with it. Those, I suppose most people who are listening to this actually know about. I was just plug it enough. I wrote a book actually originally back in about 2001, 2002, which is my own personal experiments and experiences of working with Enochian. It's called Liber Choronzom. Now, just very briefly, Choronzom is one of the entities that is one of the very few Enochian entities that was identified by name, by D, in his diaries. Now, it plays an interesting role. There is this whole notion of crossing the abyss. It's a kind of some see it as a metaphor from dealing with your own internal shadow, your sort of the other side of yourself, if you like, the darker side of yourself. Others, it's like a real being that you have to face and deal with. Again, I think it's somewhere between the two. I think Choronzom exists as an archetype, but it's something that you encounter as your own personal Choronzom. You have to deal with your own personal negativity. So once you work through that, you then go into the higher realms, if you like, of Enochian. You begin to travel to these other realms of reality, these other sort of maybe other dimensions, or could just be in your imagination. I don't entirely know. I don't entirely care. I just know my experiences. And my book was basically about my personal experiences, but also one of the things that I wanted to get corrected was the spelling of the name Choronzom. Ever since Casaubon's diary was published in the 1650s, as I say, it was spelt wrong there, with the final letter being the letter N in the Casaubon, N for nose, rather than M for mother, which is the correct spelling. Also, a chap who you probably heard of before, Alistair Crowley, to get Choronzom the name to fit in the system of Gematria, which is a number letter replacement system, he added the letter H into the name. It became CHO, which, again, there's no record of ever being spelt that way by D. In fact, the name only appears twice in the whole collection of D's diaries, but they're both spelled the same way, which is the correct spelling, which, as I say, is C-R-O, N-O-Z-O-M. Forget the spelling myself now. But yeah, that's the correct spelling. That was one of the things, the reason I wrote my book was I wanted to get that fact out there, how it should be spelled correctly. So there we go. But I mean, there are thousands of Enochian entities, angels, if you like, that are supposed to exist, which you can connect with and communicate with if you follow the correct system from the what's in these diaries. But, you know, again, most of those names are unknown before Dee's time. They appear to have been an entirely new system, if you like, of magic. Now, you could say that they are completely new and unknown previously, but I tend to think they're just different. They're the Enochian version names of the entities that exist in other systems under different names. So you got it's almost like, you pronounce a person's name differently in different languages. We look at the spelling of what we pronounce in Spanish as Jesus. It's spelled like Jesus. We'd say Jesus because that's how it's spelled, but Spanish it's Jesus. You got the Manchester United manager, Jose Mourinho. A lot of people call him Jose because if he's Spanish, it's called Jose, but he's Portuguese and it's Jose. So I think some of these entities are actually known to us already from other systems. It's just a different spelling. It's a different way of pronouncing or a different name for them because it's a different system, but they are addressing the same beings, entities, whatever you want to call them.
And they have neutral energy, so you don't think that this is something that's created but good or bad?
Yes, I think so, absolutely. There's no real indication other than the Choronzom. Again, the Choronzom is described as the mighty devil. Now, one of the things I go into a lot in my book is I do think there's parallels with Choronzom and a very famous or familiar demon, if you like, in quotation marks, Samael. Now, Samael is an interesting because he, at one point early on in time, he was a servant of God. And a lot of these so-called ancient demons actually worked for God, basically. They were in God's employ. And Samuel used to go out and do the nasty stuff that God wanted someone punished or dealt with. Samuel's responsibility was to go and deal with them. And his name is also the poison of God, but he's a being of God, as many of these Hebraic demons are. They're actually, might be demons in the term of the name, but they are servants of God, which is not the modern concept of demon, which is, of course, they're servants of this archdemon Satan. Wasn't the case in those days. It was very much that they were good or bad depending on what you were doing or what they were doing for you.
I see. So if somebody was working with this system but not following the correct procedures, could that have an influence on their day-to-day?
I don't think so, to be honest with you. I am much more of the opinion that you're not going to succeed. It's like if you pick up your phone to phone somebody and you forget to push one of the numbers in, what happens?
You don't get the right person or you don't connect.
Exactly. If you're one number too short, you're not going to connect at all. So if you're missing an element of what you're doing, nothing happens.
But what if you do?
At best.
What if you do press the right number, but you haven't put,
then you get the right connection.
Then you get that connection, but you haven't put
your
protections in place. Would that then have a negative influence on your own personal mental state?
What would you protect yourself from? If you want to communicate with these things, why are you protecting yourself from them? Because that presupposes the notion that they're bad or evil or sinister or got bad intention. As I'm saying, these things don't have that at all. Okay.
I'm just asking the question.
That's fine. If you think about it, if you then ring up a friend and start swearing down the phone at them, they're going to get annoyed with you. Doesn't matter who they are. Yeah. So say if you'd like ring up and say, "Oh, hello, I wonder if you could help me out here. I've got this little thing going on. I wonder if you could perhaps give me some advice." They'll be friendly and help you. They won't automatically try and rip your face off just because you're asking them a question. That's what I mean. These things aren't inherently good or evil. It depends on what you do or you address them. And one of the modern things about, as you know from various ghosty programs, that most people will be of the mindset, it's evil, it's bad, it's nasty. But, going back to before about the original origins of the term demon, is daemon. For the Greek, which is the whole idea of a spiritual being, a spiritual entity that doesn't either good or bad. It just depends on who you speak to, how you address it or what you're asking it to help you with. Same with a human being, a human can be nice or nasty. No one's inherently, the Christian church might say so, but no one's inherently evil. Well, some people are, but very few. Most are like good or bad, depending on, how you address them or what you ask them to do or what you want from them.
Mm. So, like you were talking about Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
He's in the Bible.
Yes.
So isn't this just a form of belief system that has sort of been translated down into this new language?
Very possibly. No, I can't give you an absolute
No, I know. I'm just thoughts that are occurring to me. I mean, we talked earlier on in the show. You talked about the Book of Enochian that wasn't around when John Dee was around, but there was obviously references to it because he was interested in that.
Yes.
And you said that the Book of Enochian was an interesting thing because that person was allegedly taken from Earth and taken alive into the heavenly realms.
Yes.
Looking at it from quite modern eyes, that's almost abduction.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. Again, that gets in that deeper kind of folkloric territory that what would have been described as 100 years ago as being taken by angels to God's side or into Garden of Eden or whatever. Or today be described as being taken by aliens to other planets or into their spaceship. These stranger experiences that we may or may not actually be having, they are described in ways that are reflective of the society and culture from which they come. So you do have far more common these days the description of people experiencing abductions to spaceships and things like that, whereas before you'd be taken off to fairy realms or underground realms or other realities like that. So what I'm saying is a lot of what we believe is coloured by our cultural and social ideas. But there is a reality beneath that there is something that happens. You are dealing with something. I mean, I don't think for a moment I actually literally went to another reality and wandered around saying hi to strange creatures. But I was experiencing something that was very strong and very real and very, very powerful imagery that felt more real than just me imagining or making it up. I mean, it's hard to explain. It really is hard to explain that when you are seeing beings that look... I mean, one of the strongest abiding memories I have was the first time I dealt with or found myself in the realm of Corondon itself. I can still even now see it in my mind's eye, this white city. If you don't want to describe it, it's like stones, like an ancient city, and this large throne with this person sitting on it, and I couldn't look into his face. It was too bright. It was literally like light coming from the face. It was so bright, it was almost blinding. And the sense of there was a gap in front of me that I had to walk out across that gap, even though didn't appear to be any kind of floor or surface, just a great hole, literally an abyss. But I had to walk across it. I had to have faith that I'd be safe and wouldn't die by walking across the gap, which is what in my vision I remember doing. And then sort of reached to the realms, you're allowed to continue through the gates, if you like. And that's quite a literal interpretation of the whole notion of the abyss. But to me, that's what I was experiencing, was crossing over, if you like, into that other realm. That you could only get so far. This kind of deeper connection with reality, with the universe, however you want to phrase it, really. I mean, I often give up trying to find the right term for these things. Yeah. But you were connecting with something. There was a sense of some kind of connection with something that was not the mundane day-to-day or just your own imagination. But no, I didn't feel like I was in another reality. I wasn't in some other kind of dimension. It just felt like, I don't know, it's hard to really explain.
Wow, my goodness me. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I mean, the whole thing, whether you're looking at just the history of John Dee, his writings, his workings, or actually trying to use that system of magic sounds absolutely fascinating on so many different levels. And it sounds like you have to be very dedicated to learn how to do it.
I think only so much you need to be dedicated to learn how to drive or to do anything that takes time and effort to learn to do. That's all it really requires of you, is just practice and, have that connection. I'll be perfectly honest with you, I've not actually been scrying, if you like, or travelling to these astral realms for a long time. I haven't done it for many years, to be honest with you. There's no particular reason other than my interest sort of moved forward into other areas. I mean, we're searching new stuff at the moment, which is quite different. So, but I remember it as being my first real experiences directly of thinking, wow, this is not just in my imagination. This is too much. This is too strong. This feels real. And then reading on what back in those days, the Yahoo type groups, you have the magic groups or the old Microsoft MSN groups that used to exist that have long since disappeared now, that people were posting up their experiences and thinking, blimey, that's similar to what I was seeing. That's really crazy. That's the thing that really caught me. I was really taken aback by the similarity, that there was enough difference for me to recognise it wasn't the same experiences of them, but but it was similar enough to think this is not just random. And it's not stuff I'd read previously, because by that point there weren't that many books around. Now there are books abound, fortunately, all over the place about John Dee and Enoch and magic, etc., etc. But in those sort of, you talk about late 80s, early 90s, there weren't many books around at all, and there was no internet as such in those early days. And even then, in the early 2000s, it was nothing like it is today. You know, no bloody Facebook or any of those kind of groups out there, which there are many of them now, and lots of sort of published writers. Back in those days, again, you couldn't self-publish. It was impossible. You had to get a real publisher or not be published at all. Now it's much easier, of course, and there is stuff comes out that's good. There's stuff that's a bit pants.
Well, that's pretty generic in most subjects, though, I think you'll find.
Yeah, unfortunately. There's some very good stuff that's come out, you know. Well, one of the key things for me that I wanted to address that was very much a thing at the time was that what was available was very, very heavily influenced by the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn made substantial changes to Dee's system, added an awful lot that wasn't present in Dee's time, just in an attempt to try and work it better into the Golden Dawn's own system of magic, which would be a whole other show to talk about, in fact. But I wanted to get back to the original. Well, what could you get from looking at just Dee's own diaries? Is there a system that was coherent and workable? In terms of the astral travelling, yes. I mean, other stuff is all bits and pieces. You've got to really dig through all sorts of stuff that they're talking about that is often about, as I said, when they were travelling around Europe, they were getting lots of advice and suggestions from these angelic beings as what to do next. A lot of that appears in the diaries. So it tends to be a bit kind of waffly in places, if you like. But when you get into the real core stuff, there's a system there, but I wanted it to be just based on that system that was present in Dee, what Dee would have worked for himself, not what was introduced by other people, which included the change in the spelling of Choronzon back to its correct spelling.
Wow, thank you so much for joining me, Andy, tonight. It's been an absolutely fascinating subject we've covered tonight. And like you say, it was sort of like the very beginnings of a lot of workings that people do nowadays that have taken it and moved it forwards without even realising where the basis of that actually came from. Where can we find your books, Andy?
At the moment, it's currently undergoing a second printing. It's coming out as a new version, same publisher, Ain Sophia Press, which I'll put a link in the old Parasearch page, which I probably have done many times before, but another one in there. He's bringing out, it's a second edition, but there's no change to the internal text. He's just changed the cover. Basically, it's changed printers, and they've offered this new version for the cover, whereas before it was a cloth bound. Now it's kind of hardback, but it's got an image on the cover, which is quite nice. It's a painting of John Dee that was commissioned in the 1800s, and that's the new cover for it. So I'll put a link in the Parasearch page for anyone who wants to order a copy. It should be out before the end of the year, so literally next week I think he's expecting a new delivery of books. If not, it'll be early in the new year. But it's called Liber Choronzon, and it gives you all you need to basically work with the Enochian cores, the scrying experiments. You can have a go yourself. I explain exactly how it works. It's all in there. So it's kind of designed to be for a beginner if you want, but if you're more advanced, you can skip the first chapter basically with the advanced stuff straight off further on.
Wow. Okay. Definitely share that link into the Parasearch page. Guys, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been an absolutely fascinating topic. I'm sure at some point we will revisit this form of workings, I'm sure, because I find it absolutely incredibly fascinating. Now, next Sunday on the Spirit Dimension show, I'm actually joined by a co-host, Ashley Nibb, and we're talking to Dr. We've got a PhD in the house, Cal Cooper, who has been instrumental in the SPR in regards to ITC, which is intertransmental communication, as amongst other things, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, next week, a fascinating topic, one that I'm only just touching the edges of, really. Looked into it briefly, and then I came across Mr. Cal Cooper and was like, oh, okay, let's learn a bit more about that one. Now, on Monday, we have the Parasearch UK Radio Encore show. We discuss the recent Amethyst Realm, who was on this morning, regarding her topic of sex with ghosts. if you you need to have a listen to that one. It's a little blue, it's a little bit racy, and it's very, very funny. I know. So please join us tomorrow at 9 p.m. On Tuesday we have the Paranormal Concept Show, and we're looking at the dark side of the paranormal with Donna Fox Butler. Hopefully, if Donna feels better. On Wednesday evening we have Haunted Histories with Penny G. Morgan, and as always, that's a fascinating show looking at the myths, legends and history of haunted locations. On Thursday, we have our very own Caroline Rooney, Kaz Rooney. She is in the house talking ufology, believe it or not. She's having a go at ufology and conspiracies regarding ufology. She has a guest on with her. On Friday evening, Mark, Kaz and myself are looking at folklore surrounding our Christmas traditions. So that, as always, is a manically funny and informative, I'd like to just say, show. And again, next Sunday we have Mr. Cal Cooper in the studio on the Spirit Dimension. We are on YouTube, so go and give us a little subscribe. We are on Facebook as a group and a page, so please make sure you go over and follow that. And if you like what you hear, tell your friends about us and get them to listen. And on that note, I bid you all a very, very farewell. Thank you again, Mr. Mercer, for joining me.
That's all right.
And I'm sure we'll talk to you very soon. And on that note, thank you and farewell.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.